Sustainability pioneer Gil Friend joins the Plutopia podcast this time. He has been called one of the 10 most influential sustainability voices in America.
We currently mostly have a system where if I make something and sell it to you, I'm done. It's out of my hands, it's in your hands. There's a system called extended producer responsibility that's in place in a number of places around the world that says the producer is responsible for the safe disposal of the stuff they make at the end of its life. So I, as a producer, have responsibility throughout the value chain. So therefore, I need to think about the implications and the costs of recovery at the end of life, and I start to design things differently. We saw an early version of that in the United States with bottle bills, with deposits on soda bottles. Much more sophisticated in other countries. So that notion of responsibility, connecting actions and consequences, reducing and eliminating the subsidies, both the actual payments to companies, but also the pervasive subsidy of giving folks a free ride for their bad effects.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Plutopia News Network podcast. I'm John Lepkowski, and my partner is Scoop Sweeney, who's sitting right over there in Elgin. Our guest today is Gil Friend. Gil is the founder, chair, and CEO of Natural Logic, Inc., Incorporated, and Critical Path Capital, and he advises various companies, communities, investors on value-driving sustainability strategies. Gil has been a noted sustainability pioneer for more than 50 years, quite a while, and is widely considered one of the founders of the sustainable business movement. And I could just add that Gil and I met some years ago when we were both affiliated with a blog called World Changing, where I'm sure we published several of our more interested writings. Did you publish very much there, Gil?
What contributed to the book?
To the book? Was it the book, but also the blog? Did you do some blogging there?
Might have done some blogging. I was doing a lot of blogging in those years.
Yeah, I wrote a ton of blog posts for World Changing. All of that is vanished now. It's hard to find. I think it's gone away, but you can see it through the Internet Archive. Yeah. So you have a master's degree in systems ecology. Can you describe what that is?
I've got to reach back into the ancient vaults to tell you. It's looking through a living system lens at complex systems. It's shifting from a kind of mechanistic piece by piece, item by item worldview to recognition that there are patterns and networks of patterns that are that reveal different things in a more mechanical look that things like living systems would be. An example is agriculture. I was focusing at the time, and many things to point out there, but the practice, the common modern agricultural practice of here's a field of crops and it's got a bug in it and I don't want the bug there, so I'm going to bring out a chemical to kill the bug. I would think of that as a mechanistic approach. A more systems approach would be say, what's the health of the crop? What's going on in the soil that nurtures the crop? What other plants are in the ecosystem with it? What other insects and other creatures are in the ecosystem together with it? How do you bring the whole thing into productive balance so that it's both profitable and sustainable? And that combination is the linchpin in all the work that I've been doing.
Didn't you build a rooftop farm at one point?
That's like a long time ago, but yeah, in Washington, D.C., about a mile from the White House on the roof of the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, we built a solar greenhouse and a hydroponic farm, raised tomatoes and cucumbers and cantaloupe melons on the roof there. Probably one of the first rooftop farms in the United States.
Well, it sounds like systems ecology would sort of set you up for sustainability, but what's your version or your description, I guess, your story about what drew you into the sustainability movement?
John, the story really goes back to Bucky Fuller. I was a year out of college. I was living in Washington, D.C. I found Bucky's work through the Whole Earth catalog. Um, got a copy of Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth, which I inhaled and thought it was the most lucid thing I'd ever read. Handed it to my roommate, who couldn't get through it, couldn't make any sense out of it at all, because Bucky would go on like, sentences that were pages long. But for me, it was like, it was water to my soul. I tracked him down at Southern Illinois University, called to get some publications that I couldn't find anywhere else. And they said, well, we're having a World Game workshop this summer. You ought to come on out. And so to the dismay of my friends who were planning to go to the Rockies for the summer for the first Rainbow Family gathering, proto Burning Man, if you will, to smoke dope and run naked in the mountains all summer, I went to Carbondale, Illinois to sit in libraries all summer and to ask the question of what would it take to have a world that works for 100% of humanity in the shortest possible time through spontaneous cooperation without ecological offense or the disadvantage of anyone. That was Bucky's formulation of the thing. And we spent, 80 of us spent a month in deep dive design charrette looking at that on planetary scale in food and agriculture, energy, buildings, transportation, communications, recreation, culture, health and medicine, a number of other areas. And it was transformative for me, both because of the depth of the process, the whole systems nature of the work we did, and a very interesting move that they described as normative planning. Currently, people call it backcasting, where we in each of the 10 focus areas, a group would take stock of where are we now. So in the case of food and ag, where I was working, how many people on the planet? What are their nutritional requirements? How does that map against the amount of food being produced? What technologies are involved? What consequences? And then stand in an imagined future. Let's go 50 years out. There's going to be 9 billion people on the planet. What are their nutritional requirements? What will it take to feed them? And then reverse engineer the mission, which is really mind-opening, because if you stand in the present and look out to an imagined future, everything can seem impossible. It's so big, it's so daunting, it's so unpredictable. How do we know what's the best next move to take? When you stand in the future and reverse engineer, like you might do if you guys are old enough to remember the maze puzzles in the newspaper, with a pencil and a maze. And I learned as a kid that sometimes if I went backwards, I could see things that I couldn't see going forwards. NASA learned this in the Apollo mission, where after President Kennedy's, pronouncement of we're going to land on the moon and bring them back alive within 10 years, NASA said, well, how did we do that? And they worked backwards from the successful launch. What had to happen in the last year for the mission to be successful? What had to happen in the year before the last year for the last year to happen? So it's one of two profoundly innovative moves that NASA made. The other thing they did, of course, was they created a department of it can't be done. And every time they ran into an impossibility, how are we going to feed these people on the capsule or manage the computer control systems for controlling the launch and so forth, instead of going back to the President of the United States and saying, sorry, sir, we can't do the mission, not an acceptable option, right? They would develop the impossibility into a design spec and walk that design spec down the hall to the Department of It Can't Be Done and say, could you guys please invent this? And they did that 3,000 times in the course of the Apollo project. And they did, invented everything from Tang, which is not something to be proud of, maybe, to fastening systems that could keep the heat shields attached to the capsule during 25,000-degree reentry temperatures. So they were not stopped by impossibility. And so, as you might imagine, that has fed me in my work over the years, where I see challenges not as impossibilities, not as problems, but as what might be possible here? What do we need to do?
There are people among us who think the end is here already and that we should just be moving into space and going to Mars. I think you know who some of those people are. How does that relate to sustainability? Is that sustainable, or is that just a good excuse for forgetting about protecting the Earth?
I think you've answered your own question. Look, I'm as you might know from my NASA example, I'm a big fan of space exploration. I've been a supporter of NASA my whole life. I'm a science fiction kid. I see promise and possibility there, but not as an excuse for what we're doing here. You handle the basics first. The people who you're not naming are going to Mars will be a few people over a very long period of time at great expense. Meanwhile, we've got work to do here. I think we've got the capability of having a thriving human society on Earth that is sustainable, that takes care of a human population, that takes care of a living world, and has some spare change to do wild-eyed things like explore space. But let's be clear on what the priority and the sequence is here.
Well, when you try to do whole Earth planning and management, though, there's such a degree of complexity there. It seems, that seems like a good one for the Department of the Impossible, you know?
Well,
how do you manage the complexity?
You don't manage the complexity.
Or does it manage you?
Well, you can't manage complexity by definition, but you can understand it maybe and dance with it. And I think the place to start is to look around us. And when I look around us, I see, 3.8 billion years of experience in, quote, managing in your world, or generating productive, adaptive, resilient, and sustainable systems. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. The R&D has already been done. The R&D is open source. It's free. The living systems of this planet, what do we know? We know they essentially run on renewable solar energy, right? They produce no long-term persistent toxins in the living systems. They are circular. The waste of one organism is the foodstuff of the next. The control hierarchies are relatively flat, and it works, and it works every day wherever you are in the world. So question number one is, what can we learn from that? How do we take that 3.8 billion years of R&D and apply that, bring that into the human management systems and the way that we interact with the living world? And it turns out that's not only a nice idea, it's a practical idea, it's a powerful idea, it's a profitable idea. And so in my work with corporations, the message for most of this time has been, you have opportunities for business success, for greater profit, less risk, better brand recognition, better employee loyalty, on down the list, by operating your business in harmony with the principles of the living world rather than against them. And that's borne out in industry after industry, large and small scale.
How about government? Have you worked with the government? I know you worked with Palo Alto, the city of Palo Alto. How well does that work?
I was the first chief sustainability officer for the city of Palo Alto. I worked with the U.S. General Services Administration, which is the operations management of the federal government, runs all the buildings, does all the purchasing, and so forth. It works the same everywhere because the laws of nature are the same everywhere, and human beings are the same everywhere. The management systems are somewhat different. The control principles in a government are different than in a corporation, for good and bad, John. Look, on the one hand, a business has a much narrower focus typically of, we got to get the widgets on the truck today and we got to do it profitably. And we've got a small group of stakeholders, shareholders, board members, and so forth who are making the decisions. In government, well, I'd like to think about the city of Palo Alto, where we had a city council of 9 people, but actually a board of directors of 66,000 people, all of whom had opinions and things to say and the right to say them. And so finding coherence, common purpose, alignment in the government is a different kind of challenge than in a company, whether a small business or a large corporation. But in all those cases, it comes down to, what do people care about? What do they really care about? Not what do they say they care about, but what do they really care about? And what kind of conversations do they have with each other? What kind of requests and promises do they make of each other? And whether you're in a family or a family-owned business or a McDonald's franchise or a global corporation or a state government or the White House, those are still the pieces of the puzzle.
So currently we have a fairly chaotic, I would say, political environment. And I just wonder about how to meet that challenge. I mean, how do we meet the challenge of dealing effectively, like becoming more sustainable, but also dealing effectively with something like climate change, which is, you and I may see that as an emergency, an important issue. There's some people who say that it's not an issue we should even be thinking about.
Mm-hmm. Well, what's the task? Is the task to convince everybody to think the same way, or to find the leverage points, the points of action, and the common and the common agendas and the possible alliances of common interests so we can do some things together?
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge is to survive, and we can see what the trend is with climate change and how there's a potential that we could reach a point where it may be difficult to inhabit the planet. And I don't think we're all going to Mars. Elon may go and take some of his friends, but I don't think we're all going to be able to go there. So to me, it seems that, we have a challenge of sort of getting enough people on board that we actually can take effective action to mitigate or at least adapt to climate change.
Yeah, well, I would say that that's happening. It's not happening fast enough by any means, but it's happening. You look, the United States in the last few years has passed the biggest investment in climate adaptation, technology shift, and so forth than anyone's ever done. Renewable energy around the world is growing at exponential rates, is cheaper than fossil fuels in most parts of the world. And that's a pretty unstoppable trend. That's despite the fact that we subsidize fossil fuels to the tune of $7 trillion a year. Even so, renewables are outcompeting fossils. You go to China, which does, gets a bad rap on a lot of this stuff, but unknown to most people, China has, for I'm not sure how many 5-year plans now, has had a central committee level commitment to creating an ecological civilization. Now, what does that mean? We dive into that more deeply, but there's a profound recognition. They did the math a long time ago. They realized that they could not bring 1.5 billion or whatever the number is, 1.5 billion people up to good living standards using the technologies of the 20th century. They couldn't duplicate American technology in the same ways. They had to be much more inventive because the stuff isn't just there to do that for that many people. So, Europe is another story. Europe has been proceeding very aggressively for, 20 plus years now on building environmental and sustainability concerns into the structure of their policies and regulations and programs, and have probably, I think in a lot of areas have been 15 years ahead of the United States. And so for us, it's kind of a bellwether of where do you look to see where the puck is going. Notably for Europe, a lot of their work has been guided by simple, fundamental, unarguable scientific principles like those that came out of the natural step in Sweden. And if you look at the European regulations on, for example, the restriction on hazardous substances in electronics, or their take-back regulations, all of those trace their way back to this very simple set of science-based principles that are understandable by CEOs and understandable by third graders and everybody in between, and become part of the framework and matrix of the political structures, business structures, and cultural expectations of people. And we have to work at all of those levels.
I've watched our political leaders being given those scientific principles that prove that sustainability is possible and the best choice. But you look at their record and you see all the money from the fossil fuel industry coming in the back door and subsidizing their political campaigns. So given that situation, is it really possible to win against these fossil fuel dollars that are flooding our politics?
Well, look, Scoop, I don't know what is possible or will be possible. I'm a futurist who's given up predicting the future because I think it's a fool's game to try to do that. And what you're describing is clearly one of the big constraints in the American political system. We have legalized bribery at the foundation of our system because of Citizens United and some other decisions. interesting metric is track the ratio of number of lobbyists to number of Congress people over the past 50 years, and it's gone wackily out of kilter. So there is that. And yet, renewables are growing exponentially. And renewables are more economical than fossil fuels almost everywhere on the planet. And the folks at the head of the fossil fuel companies recognize that they are managing an end game. Now, their perspective as fiduciaries to their shareholders is to manage that as profitably as possible and get every ounce of profit out of every ounce of oil before the game shuts down. But they know the game will shut down. So you've got a body of interest in the fossils, and you have a body of interest in everybody else. And that's the political dynamic we have to consider here, as well as the economic dynamic. There was an initiative in California 30 years ago, maybe 25, 30 years ago, where a bunch of Texas oil interests, sorry, Scoop, mounted and funded an initiative in California to shut down California's now 50-year-old world-leading energy efficiency and sustainability transition strategies. And a really interesting thing happened. Typically in those kinds of initiatives or political dogfights, you find the environmentalists lining up on one side of the table and the business interest lining up on the other side. We've all seen that in many cases before. It's really familiar. It didn't happen that way this time. On the one side was the fossil fuel industry, and on the other side was the enviros and most of the other business community, who recognized that their interests, their long-term economic interests, were not the same as the fossil fuel interests. And so they came out in support of, of efficiency, renewables, technology development, growth of a sustainability economy, and so forth. And we beat back that initiative despite being outspent, I don't know, I forget, 5 or 10 to 1. So different kinds of political alliances are possible if we focus, again, not on what people say they believe in, but on what people really care about. And some of the work is peeling the layers to help people get to what they really care about. Because we're all stuck in our histories and our belief systems. Where it shows up in my world, and it's related to your question, is I'll talk with corporate executives who about the upside business opportunities of an aggressive sustainability strategy. And we'll look at capital investment and we'll look at return on investment. And these very smart, very capable, very successful and experienced people will say, well, but I can't afford to do that because it's sustainability and sustainability costs more. And we said, no, wait a minute. We just showed you the numbers about how it's not going to cost you more. It's going to be more profitable. The background thinking, the assumptions that everybody's been raised in over their entire lives is that better costs more. The fact is, not necessarily. It's what we call innovation. Getting people to see what they're not used to seeing is a big human challenge. So, I don't usually quote Vladimir Lenin, but he said famously that one of the primary responsibilities of a revolutionary is to patiently explain. It's not how the Bolsheviks played, in fact, but the idea is sound.
Well, the efforts in California have paid off for California, but there was a leak sprung in California, and it all ended up here in Texas. All of these companies moving their headquarters out of California and dropping them here. And we all know the reason for that. It's unregulated here. But the general population doesn't benefit a lot from this, but certain other people do. So, that's kind of the double-edged sword there. You can win, but then some people will lose because they're going to have all these people ending up in their backyard, which is happening to me right now with these companies.
Yeah. Well, we live in the human and political condition we live in and do our best where we can to improve things where we can. I mean, do I have a magic wand that fixes everything, including the California-Texas rift? No. Do I have strategies that will work with cities in Texas, or cities in California or cities in Mississippi, or cities in Bangladesh? Yeah. And companies in all those cases, in whatever industry you want to name. I mean, technology, food and ag, textiles, built environment, mobility, finance. We see innovative transition strategies working and paying off across the industrial sectors and across the map around the world. Magic bullet, no. Pill to drop in the water and it will dissolve and everything will be hunky-dory. No, there's work to do here. And, and it involves changing entrenched political systems, economic practices, operating practices and organizations, and the habits of people. I like to ask when I do a stump speech talking about changing practices, I'll ask how many people here have ever tried to change a habit. Most of the hands go up because we've all done that with some success and some failure. And then I ask how many of you ever tried to change a loved one's habit, like spouse's habits, and everybody laughs. And then okay, how about trying to change the habits and practices of 10 people in your company, or 100 people in your company, or 100,000 people in your company? Daunting, right? And yet all of those things happen. You probably know people who've stopped smoking after smoking 3 packs a day for their whole lives. People who've become vegetarians after being meat eaters, who've started to exercise, who've rebuilt relationships that were falling apart, who've trained for the Olympics and won gold, beating somebody out by 100th of a second, who've changed the commitments and directions of a company, who've changed a political and social culture in a society. We're all of kind of similar age. When we grew up, people smoked all over the place. They don't do that now in most of this country, right? When I grew up, it was cool to hold your liquor. In fact, it was cool to hold your liquor and drive. It's shameful now to do that. How did that change? I mean, that one changed because a couple of mothers whose daughters had been killed in car accidents by drunk drivers created a national movement called Mothers Against Drunk Driving, which over the course of some years basically revoked the social permission for that being cool. Some of it's change of laws, stiffer penalties. Bulgaria used to be executed for driving drunk and killing somebody. Some of it was changing the expectations and the norms. Bartenders saying, I'm not going to give you that next drink, I'll take your keys. People learning to be designated drivers, people training their kids in a different way. It's a slow process, but it's been a pervasive one, so that what's normal in this country around that is different. You talk to kids coming up today and what's normal for them around diet, energy, environmental responsibility, certainly gender and race relations, very different than when we came up. So that points to a possibility of how this sort of change that you're asking about takes place. Some of it's policy and regulation, some of it's taxes, some of it's business practices, some of it is how do we live together?
This is making me wonder whether the attempts to change governance through addressing government might not be the best way to go. Maybe the way that you change governance, maybe the way you change the things we do things is go through business like you do, and through corporations, and also figuring out ways to address it through culture.
I think it's all the above, John. Different people can pick an area to focus in based on their strengths and inclinations, but the work is to do all of those. And they're not separate because, businesses are made up of people, or as Gregory Bateson would say, parts of people. Or as Fernando Flores would say, the conversations that people have together in this thing we call a business. But businesses live in an environment with laws and policies set by government. So that interaction is there. And Scoop, as you pointed out before, businesses influence what government does in legitimate and illegitimate ways. But government is what? Government is us. Government is all of us exercising our common will together to support the kind of world we want to have together, which is culture too. So all of those things are alive all the time. Some people will focus on one. The systems perspective that you asked about before says, let's be mindful of all of those pieces and how they interrelate. And where are the dynamics where I can make one move that starts to have effects in all of those domains?
Yeah, and it's like there's the Buddhist insight that nothing is permanent and nothing is, I mean, things are just sort of continuous and interdependent.
They are.
And you have to address things with that reality in mind because that is what's real.
And everything affects everything else. There's a sage named
Exactly.
Nesargadatta who was talking about cause and effect, said the cause of all things is all things. It's not like, it's not like I shoot a billiard ball and strike that other ball and it goes at a certain angle into a pocket. Yeah, there's that, but that's not biological systems. That's certainly not cultural systems. No magic buttons, no magic bullets.
But I found myself, I'm kind of wondering about what we need to do, kind of on a more like individual level, a micro level. I mean, if I'm walking out to the street and I'm kind of dumping my trash and putting out my recycling,
Mhm.
I realize one thing I realize is, wow, there's a lot of trash here. Every day I'm throwing out a lot of trash, and so is everybody else. And I'm also throwing out a lot of recycling. Is it really getting recycled?
Yeah.
How well are other people doing at separating their recycling from their trash and so forth? I mean, that's one example, but it's like there are these things that we kind of know we need to be doing, and there's some things that we do that may be more like lip service than actually something effective.
Yeah.
I mean, you see what I'm getting at?
I see what you're getting at, and you're pointing to real problems and real issues. We're not going to resolve the question of recycling in the United States on this call, but I'd be inclined to go a little bit upstream. It's not just a matter of putting out your trash and recycling, but about choosing what you buy. And do you buy stuff that generates more trash or not? Do you buy stuff that generates recyclable trash or toxic trash or not? Is the company that you're buying stuff from evolving their design processes and their products in that kind of direction? Producing stuff that is either more recyclable or that has less packaging or that has less toxics in it. And we see all those initiatives underway, some of them driven by companies, some driven by regulation. Um, you know, um, and where do I want to go with this? Part of the regulatory deal there is that we currently mostly have a system where if I make something and sell it to you, I'm done. It's out of my hands, it's in your hands. There's a system called extended producer responsibility that's in place in a number of places around the world that says the producer is responsible for the safe disposal of the stuff they make at the end of its life. So I, as a producer, have responsibility throughout the value chain. So therefore, I need to think about the implications and the costs of recovery at the end of life, and I start to design things differently. We saw an early version of that in the United States with bottle bills, with deposits on soda bottles. Much more sophisticated in other countries. So that notion of responsibility, connecting actions and consequences, reducing and eliminating the subsidies, both the actual payments to companies, but also the pervasive subsidy of giving folks a free ride for their bad effects. In other words, if there's a company that's producing harmful chemicals up their smokestack that's generating health effects in the population, or reduction of agricultural productivity, or deterioration of public buildings through acid rain, or whatever, all the long list of effects that pollution has, if the company had to pay for those things, do you think they'd be blowing the same amount of stuff out their stacks? Of course not. If it's a free ride, it's what I'm calling the social subsidy of externalities, then they'll do what they do within the current system. So, again, it's a dance of interaction. It's the consumer preference that says to the companies, we want more of this and less of that. It's the companies innovating in their design to produce better stuff that is more sustainable and more profitable. It's the government changing the playing field so that we're not taxing ourselves to pay for the destruction of ourselves, and rather taxing ourselves to pay for the better world for ourselves. I mean,
I'm also thinking about like what the size of my footprint is. It's not very big, my particular ecological footprint. I used to hang out with Plenty Fisk, and we would talk about, the question of awareness of of the data that you need to know in order to know what your footprint is and what your actual use is of resources, et cetera, and your impact on the environment and so forth. Most people don't know that. And I've also thought about the fact that even somebody who has, fairly limited use of resources, limited footprint like me, I've got a pretty big footprint compared to somebody who may be living in a street in India or something like that.
Sure.
And we tend to think it would be a good thing for everybody to have a better standard of living. And we think of that better standard of living in terms of what we have here, like the American middle class or whatever. But the more people that we bring on board for that standard of living, the greater their footprint. And the question is whether we have the resources, whether we can sustainably support that standard of living for everybody, or whether we need to redefine what a good standard of living is.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you're sort of answering your own question, aren't you?
I guess, yeah.
Yeah. Look, does everybody in India need a 23 cubic foot refrigerator? Not necessarily. Do they need to have, safe food available, that's preserved and protected so it doesn't go bad, so there's not the food waste that happens without refrigeration. Let's think about principles rather than technologies. What is it that people need to have a good quality of life? By all means, people should have that. We don't get to sustainability by telling India you have to suffer because there's no more room for you at the table. That's immoral and politically unfeasible. But we also don't need to say there's no reason to think that India has to develop its population with 1990s US technology. They're going to leapfrog us. I mean, China has already skipped over copper telephone wires and gone to cellular communication without having to go through the transitions that we went through that we are gradually unraveling. So that leapfrog effect is possible if people's eyes are on the prize with the fundamental principles. Renewable power, circular economy, no persistent toxic materials, bounty for all, value shared with people who create the value, not tax ourselves to destroy ourselves. I mean, the list is pretty short and pretty simple. And then the question is, how do we apply that and build the political support and market support for those things happening? The good news is that I would say all of those things are happening. There are positive trends on all those dimensions in most places in the world. The bad news is not fast enough. We are still headed for a world of hurt. And that's the challenge, is to slow that down as quickly as we can and build the transition to the next economy as quickly as we can.
That list of sustainable practices is a great list. And there are people among us who see that as a list of crimes against humanity. A certain political party looks at those things as negatives, things that you don't want the government to be helping occur.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't see any cure for that other than, just continuing to try and educate people on, it sounds uncomfortable, but if you don't do this, your children will grow up in a really horrifying, world.
Well, there's the logical persuasion of that, of educating people and so forth. There's also giving people a taste of a better experience. And you see that in the rise of Lyft and Uber and the car sharing services over the past, 10 or 15 years, is it's miserable driving to work in traffic in your own car and spending an hour and a half, locked in gridlock traffic. It's also miserable to have mass transit the way that it is in a lot of the United States, where it's, dirty and slow and expensive and so forth. But, we see mass transit done well in cities around the world, where people just don't want to have a car because it's too much hassle and too expensive to have a car. Not because someone said you can't, but because they figure out, no, I just don't want to do this. Some of that is urban planning, walkable cities where you just don't need a car. and where it takes you longer to get somewhere with a car than by public transit and walking. We see this, really dramatically in the whole realm of green buildings, which has become, become an increasingly normal thing around the world, that people are building buildings that are more energy efficient. Why? Because they're more economical. They're building buildings that have less toxic materials in them, not just because of imagined health effects, but because people feel more comfortable when they're in them. They're more productive in them. So some of this is like, is better mousetrap. Some of this is carrot rather than stick. Because let me just, rather than argue with you about it, let me give you a taste of something that you might like. A pal of mine, senior executive of one of the largest investment firms in the United States, was building a house in Palo Alto some years ago that he was trying to build as the, like the cat's meow, the best, most energy efficient passive home that you could do. And his wife was totally aboard, except when it got to the kitchen, because he wanted to put in an induction stove. And she's considers herself a gourmet chef, said, nope, don't want that. Don't want an electric stove. Don't want that. Don't want that. Have I made myself clear? Don't want that. And she was remembering, as most of us do, the old radiant coil electric stoves you can burn your hand on, which are horrible to cook on if you're trying to cook well. So he did an interesting thing. He said, "Look, let's go out and buy some groceries." Went to the grocery store, got a bunch of stuff for dinner. She thought they were going to drive home. He instead drove her to the appliance store, where he had arranged with the owner of the store and said, "Honey, here's a high-end induction range. Here's the bags of groceries. Cook us some dinner here. We're going to eat dinner here." And she did. And she looked at him and said, "I'm sold." Why? Because it was a better experience. She could cook with more control, with more ease, with better results. It was not the theoretical argument of electric versus induction or electric versus gas. It was just like, here, try this. Oh, I like it. Let's do that. So I think giving people a taste of the future, a taste of the world we want, an opportunity to experience something that's better, and back to the idea, better in relation to what they care about. He was concerned with saving energy and not having burning toxic fumes inside their home where their children would breathe them. She cared about that, but she was concerned about the experience of cooking the meals that she loved to cook. They could argue about that theoretically all they wanted, but until they could find an alignment around something that felt good to both of them in relation to what they cared about, it wasn't going to move. But it did move.
I experienced that very same thing when I moved from the Bay Area to my place here in the country, out in a forested community, and there was only electric available. I had to make that decision. In the Bay Area, it had always been gas, 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 because that's pretty much all they had available, unless you wanted to, disconnect your gas service and go fully electric, which I knew people who did that, but that was way beyond my financial means. But when I had no other choice, I thought, well, let's see what it's like. And it proved to be much better, much healthier, much nicer way of just dealing with things like cooking. I love to cook. And, it won me over, but I never imagined, before I moved out here, that I would ever be in an all electric house.
There you go. And is your cooking with radiant electric stove or induction?
It's a convection oven.
Okay.
I'm going to be getting rid of that and trying to upgrade that. But just, they actually had a propane system, which I disconnected, and it's buried in my backyard somewhere.
There you go. What some people have done is get a little 1 or 2 burner induction range that you can get on Amazon or various other places. In fact, here in the Bay Area, many of the public libraries will loan people those for a week or two so they can try it out and have the experience, like in your own home with an induction range, cook and see what the experience is like. And people find that, and again, it's like the taste is what gets people persuaded more than the argument about it. Like, taste it, try it. It's free. There's no risk. If you don't like it, you give it back. If you like it, you can go buy one. Boom. And so we're starting to see that transition happen more and more.
I think I ordered one of those little small induction plates at one time, and I found myself returning it because there was some, I can't remember what it was now. There was some issue with it where it wasn't practical for us to be able to use it in our kitchen. It must have had something to do with the electrical source.
Your mileage may vary, and it may be the models that were available at the time you tried. As with everything else technology, it keeps getting better and better. But we got one of those two burners 2 years ago, 3 years ago. Never looked back. We just love it. Do all our cooking on it.
One of the other things that you mentioned was, employee ownership, participation in profits from the company, and that sort of thing. I had a sole proprietorship when I was still working that I converted to a worker-owned co-op,
Did you? Good for you.
and I never had any regrets. I mean, it just worked really well.
Why'd you do it, John?
I had a group of contractors that I was working with, and we had a pretty good working relationship, and we started talking about having a partnership arrangement.
Mhm.
And I should preface this by saying that I had always liked the idea of employee ownership. In fact, when I was a young kid, I remember being really puzzled when I learned that employees didn't own the companies where they worked. I thought that was just weird, that it didn't make sense. So it had always kind of been in my head that it would be a good thing to do. And when we started talking about this partnership arrangement, we had one contractor involved who had been working with another co-op, had been connected with another co-op, a web hosting co-op.
Mhm.
And he suggested that structure for us. And it happens that there was an organization here in town that would help you in the transition to a co-op. So we were able to go to them, get consulting, and get a sort of robust training in how to, like what a co-op is and how to make a co-op work optimally and that sort of thing. So we had good guidance as well.
Great.
And the thing is that the company did better after we became a co-op than it did before, and I think that's part of that was because we brought more people in, and part of that was also because of the commitment everybody had to the good of the company, and everybody had to understand how the company ran. There wasn't anybody who was just kind of going off and doing their thing and unaware of how the finances were going and that sort of thing. Everybody had to kind of be aware of everything that was going on. It was pretty good. And I was just kind of thinking about what you were talking about like, if you try cooking this certain way, then maybe you'll adapt to it. Maybe you'll say, oh, this is much better. I'll do it.
Yeah.
Employee ownership is kind of like that. I think that if you try it out, you're going to like it, maybe.
Kind of like
Unless you're a CEO who gets a big cut in pay, I guess.
Well, not everybody's motivated by only money. And look, you can try it out. It's not like you can't like borrow a corporate structure for a week and then give it back. It's a little bit more complicated than that. But the experience that we see around the country is just like you said, the companies run better. They're more profitable. Absenteeism goes down. Employee turnover goes down. It's kind of obvious. Like if somebody's got a stake in the company, they care about it and they bring more of themselves to it, and they're committed to having it work better. And whether it's a co-op or an ESOP, employee stock ownership plan, or a stewardship trust, which is another model we're seeing now, there's a certain kind of, there's a good sense there. It's supported by the data, but it's also good sense. I mean, people understand. There are a bunch of companies like the one you described that help with the transition. And there's one that I know of that's in Indiana. It's a red state. The people who started the company are close to the red state governor of the red state, but they're doing employee ownership conversions, not in Berkeley, California, but in Indiana. Why? Because it seems fair and because the business benefits are good. And it's like a lot of things. And this country's funny. There are a lot of things that people will call them socialist, but they like the idea. If you talk about just the idea, they say I'm in favor of that. If you call it something else, they don't like it. So, let's focus on the nuts and bolts. Let's focus on the basic principle of share value with the people who create the value. Give people a stake in the work they do, and you actually get better businesses out the result. And that's why one of the things I've been doing the past few years is working on building a cooperative holding company that will try to do that kind of transition at scale. We're focusing on climate adjacent companies, energy, buildings, mobility, agriculture and water, circular economy. Energy and buildings, for example, think about heat pump contractors, HVAC contractors, folks who are installing new HVAC, heating and ventilating air conditioning equipment in homes, or solar contractors, or folks doing green building materials, or what have you. There's a whole load of these companies that are, not the fancy venture capital stuff you hear about, not inventing the latest new battery technology, but installing batteries in people's homes. I think of it as the picks and shovels of the next economy. There's a lot of these companies. A lot of them are owned by people who are boomers who are near retirement, may not have heirs available to take over the company, but they have employees who know the work. And so the notion is let's put together a portfolio of those companies, help them transition to employee owned, help them improve their productivity and effectiveness and growth, and have them cross own each other in a cooperative of cooperatives so that everybody's diversified. It's not like if I'm an employee of an HVAC contractor and my entire retirement nest egg is in that one company in that one city, there's some risk there. But if I'm diversified across a portfolio of companies in multiple sectors and multiple industries with a common purpose, that seems like a pretty interesting game to play.
When I was living in the Bay Area, I worked for the IT group of Kaiser Permanente, which is technically a nonprofit.
Yes,
But the experience being that it's technically a nonprofit, but it's being run like all the other profit-making companies, and it was nothing like I expected it to be. But now, John and I have kind of a nonprofit. It's employee-owned. We're the only employees, and I really enjoy the hell out of this. I mean, I enjoy getting on these broadcasts of ours every time we do it, but I used to dread driving into Kaiser Permanente, even though it was supposedly working for the common good. It was also working for the business partners.
Yeah, well, look, there's the important difference is not only nonprofit or for-profit, or I'd rather than nonprofit, I'd call it not for-profit. But there's the question of how the organization is run, right? And how, what's the mood in the room? How do people talk with each other? How is the work? Is it command and control? Do you look forward to going to work or not? That's a big one. Most people in most companies in this country would rather not go to their jobs if they had a choice. Well, how about having jobs where people want to go? Because they find meaning and impact and value, and they share the economic value. I think there's a big upside opportunity there.
Yeah, if you truly want to have a democratic workplace, part of the challenge is how leadership works. And, there's methodologies for that. There was something called sociocracy, and that spun off into something called holacracy. Yeah. And we experimented some with that. We found that it had more process than we needed in particular, but we kind of had some of those things already worked out. Yeah. But one of the things that you learn, this is something that, like Joe Ito and I did a paper years ago called Emergent Democracy. Mm-hmm. And one of the things we were concerned about was we were talking about democracy as an emergent thing and kind of thinking about concepts of closer to a pure democracy and how leadership would work there. And we realized that leadership can actually be passed around. Yeah. There's a sense in which people can kind of understand who is the best person to take a leadership role in a particular context. Mm-hmm. And if you can adapt to that really well, then then you can be more democratic than you can. I mean, to some extent, there always has to be leadership. It's hard for groups to work as groups without some form of leadership, but it doesn't have to be oppressive, and it should be something where everybody's bought into it.
Well, there you go. And look, it's
Yeah.
going to play out differently in different kinds of organizations and different scales of organizations. So, in a medical operating room, or in the cockpit of an airliner, it's a different story than if you're in like a bakery, or in a small bakery. Two examples, John. I was a scholar in residence at Bainbridge Graduate Institute some years ago, one of the first sustainability-focused MBA programs in the country. And the other scholar in residence was a general officer in the U.S. Army. Okay. Now, I'm a 60s kid. I have my ideas about war and militarism. I've never served in the military. My picture of this guy was a commander in a highly hierarchical command and control organization, where the instructions flow from the top down and you salute and say, yes, sir, and you do what you're going to do. And there is that. But he told a story that really blew my mind. He said, imagine got a platoon that's out on patrol. There's 20 guys. They've got rifles in their hands. They've got heavy pack on their back. They're going down the road on patrol. And the second lieutenant in the front of the platoon steps on a landmine and is blown to bits. What happens next? And what happens next is that any one of those 20 other people can step into command. And he or she will both be competent and be trusted by the other 19 people. And I thought, holy mackerel. That's an example of the kind of situational leadership that you were just talking about. So and it reoriented my thinking about, well, if you're in a battlefield situation, you need to have a certain amount of capability and agency from the people on the ground, because command center can't know what's happening there. So not an example that most people listening to this podcast might like, but for me, it was a very dramatic one of things were not as I thought they were if I really looked into them. Another example, different part of the world, the Mondragon Cooperative conglomerate in Spain. It's a 70-year-old conglomerate of, I forget the numbers, I think it's like 80,000 people in 100 and some odd different enterprises. Industrial, education, finance, appliances, education, social services, 70 years going. It's a cooperative. It's owned by the workers. Is it a democracy? Yes, sort of. They elect a kind of parliament. They elect, which hires the leadership. The leadership, managers manage the company, but managers are chosen by a democratic process from the workers. So you have a combination of democracy and hierarchy, both. How does the hierarchy work? Different in different kinds of companies. Manufacturing company different than an education company.
Yeah, you have to figure out how to make it work at scale. Yeah, one of the things that we talked about in talking about, well, we were going to build a larger co-op. It didn't really get off the ground, but in envisioning that co-op, one of the things we were concerned about is whether there would be some way to bring investors into the company.
Mm-hmm.
Would investors invest in a co-op? And we realized that if you scale up to a larger co-op, you just have to define roles. And an investor would have a particular role, and it may allow them to take certain amounts out of the company, out of the profits, a certain level of sharing in the profits to get their return on investment. And they may or may not have an ability to vote. You basically define roles that allow for kind of whatever structure that you're trying to build, so that everybody feels comfortable and satisfied that their participation in the organization is adequate and relevant for them.
Yep, exactly. So you're defining roles, you're defining responsibilities, you're defining stake and compensation. And all of that is a matter of design. It's like being clear on what is it that we want? What do we care about? What do the different players in this ecosystem care about? How do we invent the business structures? And, can be inventing out of whole cloth, but mostly inventing out of stuff that's been done before and is being adapted. to what you need in that enterprise. And I think that's the secret to scaling it, is to have that kind of flexibility. Certain shared practices across the entire co-op of co-ops, a lot of variation down to the individual company and workplace level. Huge opportunities there. We're even seeing now outfits as big as KKR, the giant private equity firm, that are making substantial investments into employee ownership conversions in companies in their portfolios. Why? Partly because one of their senior executives really cares about this personally. Partly because they figured out that it's really good business. They get better results, even with sharing the results broadly across the employees, than if they don't.
I can't believe it, but we're actually at the end of our hour, and it's time to end the discussion. I was going to ask you, what is the purpose of business? And I didn't get around to that.
Well, you want to run over, or you want to do another one?
Let's do another one.
Okay.
Let's do another one in the near future.
That's a great place to start.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us.
It's been a pleasure. I
Okay.
really enjoyed this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
You can follow the Plutopia News Network at plutopia.io. On Facebook, go to @Plutopia News. On Twitter, it's @Plutopia. With John Lepkowski, I'm Scoop Sweeney. This is the Plutopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.